What are you doing?
You want to be sure they're good and dead. Some are mighty hard to kill.
Alright, I'm just gonna level with you right here, right now. When I first found Lord of the Rings, The Third Age on my doorstep, I was immediately filled with an uncontrollable amount of dread. See, before this, I had played about 4 other Lord of the Rings games. The one on the Super NES, 2 on the GameCube, and like that weird Hobbit game that came out of nowhere like 10 years ago. From what I remember, they all kinda sucked. So I was pretty scared to try this, and actually, it's not bad. It's probably the best Lord of the Rings game I've ever actually played. The story is you play this guy who is following Sean Bean because reasons, which probably means that, spoilers, you're gonna find a corpse at the end of this trail. Other than that, you're basically just following the main cast of the Lord of the Rings, just like 10 minutes behind them, following their own footsteps because that's how this story advances. You are joined by generic elf, generic dwarf, generic hunter, and I believe a couple other characters that I hadn't gotten yet. And honestly, you could pretty much just superimpose the actual characters from the movies over top of them, and you'd kind of get the idea of what these characters were going for. Overall, the story and character in this game is not really particularly earth-shattering, and honestly, I think the biggest focus, story-wise anyway, in this game was based around these epic scenes, which were like these unlockable, spliced-together movie cutscenes, with like a different narrative by Gandalf, which explained more about the greater lore of Lord of the Rings, which, honestly, I respect, because the movies left a lot to be desired in that respect. So if you're looking for something that, like, fills plot holes or a greater understanding of the world, you're gonna find it here. If you're looking for an interesting original story, not so much. Now the gameplay, and this kinda shocked me out of the box, is a standard role-playing game. And I know, how is it I didn't expect this from something that's basically entirely high fantasy? Well, pretty much all the Lord of the Rings games I played before this were crappy beat-em-ups. Also, don't go and play Two Towers, that game will make you sad. The game itself follows 2 main modes. The first mode is your standard running around the environment, with the key focus of not only getting through the environment so you can catch up to the Fellowship of the Ring, but in addition to solving various sort of like side quests in order to advance past your current position. Don't worry, you don't have to go that far out of your way. They're basically just go to various little spots on the map, which are pretty much right next to where you need to go anyway. But there is something weird about this mode, and that is encounters. Because this game has random encounters, sort of. Near as I can tell, while you're running around the map, in the top left corner of your screen, you will either notice a big angry eye of Sauron, or a big blue orb of destiny. And as that faded image becomes clearer, it seems to act as both a time and a proximity trigger to a certain point. When you find that hidden point, you trigger a battle. Now the weird thing is, I have honestly no idea why there's 2 separate images when they do the exact same thing, but that's a thing that happens. And now we go to the second mode this game has, which is combat. And combat is your standard turn-based RPG. Essentially, each character takes a turn. Based on what they did and their stats relative to their enemies sort of decides the order, and certain actions and attacks can swap the order of initiative a little bit, but by and large, it's basically each character takes a turn, picks their attack, which is largely dependent on their own characters, such as the dwarf having like a specialty for axes and fire magic, the main character having the power of swords and leadership, which sort of buffs the whole party, and like the ranger has the ability to use like hunting skills and stuff. Each character has their own different list of skills, and this comes to what is probably the most interesting thing about this game, and that is how you gain skills. Every character has various skill trees, and as you use one ability within each skill tree, you will earn experience towards it. Once you've used abilities within one skill tree enough, you'll learn the next ability in that skill tree. So essentially, they kind of Final Fantasy 2'd the skill systems, which kind of lets you customize your characters to suit your own specific playstyle. Likewise, when you level, you can allocate your own stat points to your character, which allows you to give a greater sense of customization to how your own character advances in terms of strength. However, certain characters do favor certain abilities, and if you don't boost those specific abilities, you're basically going to create a really mediocre and not great character. For example, the dwarf is specifically very strong, so you probably want to boost his overall strength so he can just hit harder. Oh yeah, there is one other thing gameplay-wise I haven't mentioned, and that is Evil Mode, which basically lets you redo areas you've already ventured in the main story as the evil minion-y guys. It's kind of a neat idea, and I do like the idea of getting to play the bad guy. It's a nice little bonus feature, if nothing else. But overall, the gameplay is pretty standard and not terribly special, but that said, there's nothing particularly wrong with it either. It works in pretty much every way it needs to, and it works well. Presentation-wise, Lord of the Rings The Third Age is not really particularly good. Visually, the world tends to take its designs from the actual movie set pieces, so it does give you a sort of sense like you're actually adventuring in the same world as the movie. And that's great, but the movie designs, while grandiose, weren't the most visually stimulating. Like, there just wasn't a lot of color, and it wasn't the most interesting outside of sweeping shots and architectural stuff, and in turn that leads to a very bland looking game. Likewise, the individual characters themselves are not good, and holy crap, those faces are scary. And as for animations, well, look at this horse. Yeah, Shadow of the Colossus this game ain't, by a long shot. Although I will say, if there is one thing about the visuals I like in this game, it's that the armor and equipment for your characters do change your actual character model. And as you all know, I go crazy for that sort of thing. That at least shows that there was some effort put into this. In terms of audio presentation, it fares a lot better though. The voice acting for the main cast is alright, and I'm very impressed they actually got Ian McKellen to play Gandalf in the game. That's actually really cool. I'm impressed by that. Soundtrack-wise, it's pretty much got the entire soundtrack from the movies, so if you like the Lord of the Rings theme, you're gonna hear it here. And everything else works in pretty much every way it needs to. So while the visuals definitely take a huge hit, the audio tries to make up for it. I wouldn't say it entirely does it, but it's certainly a welcome change of pace from the visuals. Now I have to give a big shout out and thank you to YouTube user NicoDemR for once again sending a game to the show and very quickly climbing up that list of my favorite people. Once again, I'll leave a link to his channel in the description, and absolutely go check out his channel, see all the crazy awesome games he has that I'm completely jealous of, and give him a big thanks from me. Now, if you want to get a copy of The Lord of the Rings The Third Age, it's not terribly expensive, it's not hard to find, you can get it for $10 or less pretty easily, and at that price, yeah. While this game certainly isn't the most remarkable RPG on the system, or even of the time, I will say it does everything it needs to well, and if you're a fan of The Lord of the Rings, it's a pretty solid buy if you like a different take on the story. And, you know, actually want an RPG that's The Lord of the Rings. Seriously, why were they all beat-em-ups? I mean, high fantasy lends itself to role-playing. That's just sort of how it's been since RPGs were discovered both in Japan and in North America at about the same time, and yet completely differently. And I mean, if nothing else, this is probably the best Lord of the Rings game I've played, and as far as my memory goes, this was better than the Final Fantasy games of the time. Actually, come to think of it, it's better than the Final Fantasy games of now. Final Fantasy really went down the toilet after the Super Nintendo. Anyway, if you want a Lord of the Rings game, grab this one. Ignore, like, pretty much all the others, because I've played most of them and they're all kind of crap. And this one is at least a playable, if a little bit bland RPG. So for its low price, it's not bad.